is about 30 minutes long, so it's a little bit longer than advertised, and we may have time for 1 or 2 questions afterwards, but we are due to finish by 4:30, so it may be that we perhaps only have time for 1 question at the end of John's presentation. So Daniel, if you're ready, would you like to set John's presentation going, please?
Hello, this is John Field. As some of you know, I'm the man who lies awake at nights worrying about listening. Somebody has to. Recently, I've been giving some thought to the kind of listening that takes place in interactive communication, especially in conversations of the kind that tests of speaking try to model. I should warn you from the start that this talk is not a research presentation. It's a set of random and rather idiosyncratic observations of listening in use that I hope might start a few ideas running. They might perhaps be of interest to test designers and anyone who trains raters to pass judgment on what we have come to know as interactive competence. First, a very brief and selective introduction. There's been a lot of interest recently in the idea of interactional competence. In other words, the construct that tests of speaking, or more strictly, tests of oral interaction, aim to tap into. An example is Galaxy 2014, who investigated test candidates speaking in pairs to try to establish what kind of moves each participant made in contributing towards the discourse. And she looked at things like topic development, and relevantly for the present talk, listener support. And by that, I think one can understand things like back channeling and constructing a joint representation of what two listeners hear. There's also been interest in the contribution of listening to scores, to rated judgments of second language oral communication. Nakatsuhara, 2012, compared performance on tasks that were interactive and those that were non-interactive, and demonstrated the important part that listening proficiency contributed if one was scoring an interactive one. Similarly, Oki compared the scores from presentational speaking tasks, in other words, tasks where the candidate was simply presenting a topic with no listening involved, with those from integrated listening into speaking ones. And his results showed that listening actually adds markedly to the demands that a test makes upon a candidate. Though we should note, of course, this was in relation to an integrative rather than an interactive context. Nonetheless, it's clear that listening does add to difficulty, to task difficulty. There's been little attempt by commentators to get inside the head of the listener and to try to specify if there is something markedly different between the listening processes that occur during an interactive oral test, or for that matter, a real-world conversation, and those that are employed in our classic type of listening test, simply using recorded material and questions. This might have important implications for the descriptors that we use in examiners' rating scales, if we want to make sure that those scales relate to overall communicative competence, rather than relying too heavily upon simply or exclusively speaking skills. I'm going to look at the question from 2 perspectives. A rather frivolous discourse one, in which I'm going to look at some simple conversational exchanges. So something rather different from what Galaxy did. I'm not looking at speaker terms or anything like that. And then a more serious cognitive one. And what I'm going to be talking about is purely interactive tests of listening. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon of speaking. In other words, I'm not going to be talking about presentational tests, clearly, because there's no listening involved. And I'm not going to be talking about integrated tests, where the skills are effectively staged, rather than interactive ones, where there's a to and fro between listener and speaker roles. And I'm thinking particularly of the types of test where there's an examiner who is sometimes an interlocutor, sometimes possibly observes candidates working in pairs. So let's first of all consider interactive listening from a rather light-hearted discourse perspective, but one that may shed some light upon something going on that we haven't really accounted for so far. There's been a tendency to assume, in fact, that interactive listening is a lot easier than other types. This is particularly true, I think, amongst English language teaching specialists. And it seems to reflect assumptions about language and about context. There's the notion that in an interactive situation, the language is likely to be simpler. But I'm not entirely convinced that colloquial language is necessarily more accessible. Sometimes, especially if there's a lot of idiom in there, it may not be. The second assumption seems to be that the delivery may be slower in natural conversation than it is in a presentation. In fact, the facts show the opposite. Presentational material is often slower, more deliberate, and it's relatively obvious why, because the speaker has planned it, and therefore it's more evenly paced. There is the notion, I think, that the speaker is usually visible, and that this helps, and indeed it does, but the demonstration by McGurk and fellow researchers, which is quoted, really relates to the ability to distinguish phonemes. It's quite clear we do use the sight of speakers' lips to help us to do this, but that's not quite the same as saying that a word and a phrase and at clause level, this is going to help us. Unless, of course, the speaker is gesturing or pointing to something or whatever. But certainly that one remains true. But the last one, there are opportunities for repair if comprehension fails. It's also true, but it ignores the fact that the listener is usually expected to use confirmation check routines. In other words, in a communication test, the test of oral communication, if a listener said, no understand, they're actually going to be marked down because they don't have the right routine. For example, sorry, I didn't quite follow. Okay, so here are some samples of interactive speech, rather tongue-in-cheek, and the kind of stuff, I'm afraid, that you still occasionally get in ELT course books. I'm just going to try and prove some very, very simple points about the role of form in interactive listening. So here's one. Do you eat very much broccoli? I can't say I do. It's very good for the heart. Is it? I never knew that. If you look at this carefully, you see there's a sort of interchange of words at, well, I suppose almost at a syntactic level. The question form of the first speaker is reflected, the word do, is reflected in the answer of the second speaker. The word it's, produced by the first speaker, finds an echo in is it, in the second speaker. This may sound very trivial, but it does suggest that there is a role for form alongside meaning in this kind of conversation. Here's perhaps a more useful one. Where are you off to? Me, I'm on my way to Cairo. How about you? I'm going there too. Really, what a coincidence that is. Sorry. As I say, these were very tongue-in-cheek. But if you start looking at this, the jagged arrows are indications that listening is taking place. But the question is anything apart from the extraction of meaning going on? And I think it is. First of all, there's a rather elaborate trading of pronouns. You know, what is you to me is not me to you. We're having to swap between I and you and so on. Okay, this is rather obvious. But also interesting is the fact that to Cairo is replaced by the word there. There is something unacceptable about conversations where one speaker repeatedly repeats the exact wording of the first speaker. These are not natural conversations. There are, I suspect, ones that sometimes occur in tests of interactive communication. Here's a better example from the same dialogues. Where are you off to? The first speaker says. The second speaker says, I'm on my way to Cairo. The first speaker says, I'm going there too. In other words, what they're doing is responding to each other by not parroting, but actually reformulating the sentences, the way in which the central issue is being discussed. There are different forms of words introduced as a kind of bridge building component in the conversation. Also interesting, is the way in which how about you refers to a whole proposition. I'm on my way to Cairo. And similarly, what a coincidence that is also refers to a whole proposition. In other words, if we're using something like how about or that, we are not simply echoing the language of the other. We are referring to the complete idea. So things are operating at two levels, it seems to me. They're operating at the level of the word, where words are echoed or substituted, and we're operating at the level of the concept as well. So the major conclusion that I'm trying to draw is that an interactive listener isn't just concerned with meaning, but also retains certain aspects of the form used and uses them as the basis for upcoming responses. Even if those responses simply change the form, they still show an acknowledgement of the form that the original speaker used. This is quite interesting because it runs counter to a cognitive listening, which regards the listener as under memory pressure and pressure of time to turn the form of an utterance into an idea as soon as possible. The whole point about this is, if you start trying to carry words around in your head, you enormously increase the load on working memory. So the idea is that after hearing a clause, what you do is turn the thing into an idea, reject the form of words that you've heard. Whereas these examples suggest that there's a much greater retention of the form of words than is generally recognized. And of course, then an interactive speaker also has other discourse roles, which I haven't discussed, as well as potentially retaining some of the elements of the form of the interlocutor's speech. They'd have to do things like back-channeling, confirmation of understanding. Yes, that's a good point. Checking correct understanding. I don't really like the term negotiating meaning because I don't think that meaning is negotiable, but certainly negotiating understanding. Are you suggesting that? Topic development, adding to what the other speaker said, and turn taking, the kind of things that Galaxy looked at. But all of these are going on at the same time as the listening. And these functions demand particular terms of phrase, which a rater might or might not recognize as a necessary part of listening competence and of the interrelationship between the listener and the speaker. So now we get on to slightly more less frivolous look at the thing and say, add to what an ordinary listener would have to do. By an ordinary listener, I mean one basically listening to a recording. And I would suggest that what has to be added performs two functions. The first function is building bridges between two speakers, and the other one is shaping the next term of the listener. This is a very simple model of what happens in listening. This is what we could say characterizes listening to a recording with no other external considerations, such as somebody who you're going to have to reply to. If you're listening to a recording or listening to any kind of sort of isolated piece of speech, you're going to have to decode, which means recognize the forms, the basic forms of speech. It's probably likely that we decode at the level of the syllable rather than the level of the phoneme. But anyway, that's decoding. We then have to group these syllables and find words in the groups that we're listening to, and identify words and draw information about those words from our mental lexicon. So those two are basically at signal level. Then there's a new level where the listener holds a group of words in their mind, and until such time as a syntactic pattern becomes evident in them. So if you like, that's a group of words level. And then finally, there's a meaning level where language is left behind, and we build a construction, a proposition from what we had heard, and relate that to the context in which it occurred. And then finally, there's discourse construction, where your new piece of meaning, your new piece of information has to be added into the conversation so far. So, sorry, this is quite a simple model, but it seems to me that once you start talking about an interactive listener, they're having to add things into the model. In other words, they're having to do more than just, for example, word search. And I would suggest that the kind of thing they're having to do is tag certain possibly important words for their own reply. I've given you some examples of that. Insert pronouns simply because, again, you know, the prevailing tradition is that you do not echo word for word what the other speaker said to you. And also, there is this phenomenon called spreading activation. If you hear the word knife, you anticipate fork, spoon, cup, whatever, and this enables you to identify them more quickly when you hear them in connected speech. Spreading activation also can determine the kind of responses that a listener makes to the speaker. So here's an example of the first one. She has a strange sense of humor. Strange, what do you mean? So a word has actually been tagged as the basis for the response. I gave Mary my address. When did you give it to her? Here pronouns have been inserted, but it's quite clear that the original pattern of words must still have been available to the listener in order to construct this. And thirdly, the first thing we saw was a lion. Spreading activation would trigger tiger, giraffe, whatever. And the response might well be, what other animals, part of the same set, did you see? The second phase of building bridges with a speaker, it seems to me, takes place at the level of parsing. You can, for example, find evidence of syntax that shapes the listener's response when they form that response. So, for example, the question form that's used. Would you like a cup of tea? Yes, I would. If the question was, did you like that cup of tea? One would expect the response, yes, I did. Do you like tea? Yes, I do. So this is a very, very simple example of syntactic constraints which operate on the listener when they're forming their own response. The other one is that occasionally words and syntax might need to be included in a response. I think I prevented an accident. So what accident do you think you prevented? It's quite clear here that far from just building an image, a recall of one single proposition, preventing an accident, in order to formulate that reply, the listener, now speaker, has had to take on board the syntax that the original speaker used. It seems to me that the same thing happens, or something similar happens, at a meaning level as well. But of course, the goal here is to shape the listener's next turn, to decide what the listener's next turn is going to be about. What one has to think about at the level of meaning construction is not simply putting meaning into context. It includes looking at thinking about a speaker's intention. This is we're very familiar with as a sort of functional approach to language. Thinking about the current topic, how can I expand on it, and possibly inference as well if there's an implied idea, recognizing what the implied idea is and responding to it. Here are some examples. Are you sure you want to go to the cinema? What we have to do there is not simply work out the fact that somebody has asked us a question about the cinema, but also the fact that the intonation has strongly suggested that somebody doesn't want to go. Okay? So, interpreting the speaker's intention, we only stayed one night in Paris. Where did you go afterwards? Again, that's how to expand upon what the speaker has said. Finally, my bag must be here somewhere. There's an inference that the bag has been lost, and so an expected reply might be, don't say you've lost it. The other thing that one has to do, of course, at the level of discourse, is to anticipate where the conversation is going next. So there I was, trapped in the lift, and it's relatively obvious the kind of thing you might ask by way of showing interest and getting the conversation going is, how did you get out? Sorry, this has been a rather detailed and rather elaborate way of trying to explain that I'm relatively convinced that both at the levels of form and at the levels of meaning, a listener in an interactive situation has a much harder job than somebody who's simply listening to. He or she has a harder job because the decisions that are made about the response have to grow out of what the listener has heard. And the response has to be made under extreme pressures of time. There are enormous time pressures on both listening and speaking. We know that a listener begins to process what a speaker is saying at a delay of about a fifth of a second. This was discovered in a task where listeners were asked to repeat what they were hearing. It may well be that first impression is revised later on, even 3 or 4 words later on, but nonetheless, the building of the impressions begins about a fifth of a second after the speaker begins to speak. The planning pauses in which a speaker plans the next utterance are again as little as 0.2 of a second, and on average about 0.5 of a second. In other words, this poor person who is engaging in both and producing a response is under very, very heavy time pressures. The joint operation of listening to an interlocutor and formulating a response is and needs to be relatively automatic in the case of native speakers to ensure that the conversation flows naturally. Clearly, it is by no means automatic in the case of second language listener speakers. until they reach a relatively high level. There are also the demands of formulating the response, finding the words. A typical adult first language speaker might have a vocabulary of about 30,000 words. If you're assembling speech fluently, you would be making the appropriate choice of words from these 30,000 alternatives 2 or more times a second. We managed to maintain that rate over a period of time. Here is what level the great speaking specialist says about it. There is probably no other cognitive process shared by all normal adults whose decision rate is so high. But we make very few mistakes, only one slip per 1,000 words or so. The point I'm making is this adds enormously to the responsibilities in terms of keeping the conversation going, and indeed the cognitive load of this poor interactive listener. There's one thing that helps the listener, and it's something useful to bear in mind. The one feature that supports the listener is that speech recognition is enormously helped when the listener is able to recognize frequent and highly familiar chunks. Much speech production, we're talking about recognition and production, then consists of delivering them as pre-assembled wholes. I wish I knew what the time is. I wish I had a bit more money, and so on. So some conclusions, and I hope we're getting back to something rather more practical. Sorry if some of it has been a little bit elaborately argued. Listening as an equal partner in a conversation is clearly much cognitively demanding than listening to a recorded conversation, because of the need to contribute. During the basic operations of lexical search and parsing, my rather crazy evidence suggested that participants have to tag pieces of language in short-term memory so that they can link their next utterance to the one that they are currently hearing. The process of meaning construction in any bit of listening does not simply entail adding a new piece of information to an evolving discourse representation. It also includes recognizing the intentions of the speaker, interpreting the pronouns, and inferring information that hasn't been explicitly mentioned. And all of that has to feed in to the rapid response that the listener is required to make when changing the role from listener to speaker. Under extreme time pressures, the interactive listener has to feed all of this information into the construction of his or her own next utterance. So there are implications here for L2 language testing. Given the very specific demands of interactive listening, it would seem important, if we're going to have any comprehensive test of L2 oral skills, to include at least one section that does target interactive proficiency. Even an integrative test of listening and speaking cannot be said to measure interactive competence. It measures the listener's ability to transform a form of information into a different form of information, to listen and then to produce the results of what has been heard, but it is not interactive. So here are some other implications. There's a need to ensure that examiners are very sensitive to the role that listening plays in this type of test. We can and should raise awareness by using specific listening descriptors to a much greater extent in our rating scales. We'll be doing it by means of training examiners to make them sensitive to indicators of where listening has succeeded and where it has failed, where there are breakdowns of understanding, possibly successfully masked by the candidate, and where there is evidence of impressively clear understanding because the examiner has actually said something rather convoluted. And finally, and I think very importantly, by using recorded samples of interactive tests, so that examiners can get a much better idea of the form that is taken by candidate responses that show understanding or that are clever enough to conceal a failure of understanding, and interventions by examiners that are to some extent controlled, because if you start looking at examiners' interventions in an actual sort of conversational context, it is very, very difficult to for them to be consistent across different students and between different examiners. We very much need greater insight into the types of interventions that examiners make and the extent to which they are controlled, both linguistically and in terms of the concepts that they represent. Thanks for listening. It's been a bit of a fast ride, but I hope that it's been of some use to some of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate that. I know we've had lots of problems, technical problems, and John has borne with me throughout the week trying to get these resolved. So, John, thank you very much.
I must apologise to everybody for the quality of the sound. We didn't really realise it was so crackly until today. And one reason I did it was just in case we had problems with the technology on the day, as indeed we did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think because this is the first time any of us have done that, you know, have done this sort of thing, and it's been made much harder by the fact that obviously we can't get together to resolve these issues. It's all had to have been done.
Could I also say that some of it may have seemed a little bit trivial, and I think I should perhaps have edited it, but it was a rather long talk, and so I've left out some of the more practical suggestions at the end. But when the thing becomes available, there will be some more practical suggestions in relation to rating, particularly.
Yes, thank you, John. And in fact, a lot of the questions have been quite a few questions, but we're running a little bit behind. So I'm going to have to pre-see them. But there have been a lot of questions posed on the chat during your presentation. And many of them concern the differences that might emerge, or the differences that might emerge when, with all of these characteristics that you've identified. How do you think that changes when, for example, you're talking about an L1 and an L2 interlocutor, or perhaps even two L2 interlocutors, as sometimes happens in exams, perhaps when students are expected to do pair work. So a lot of the points you've made and the examples you've given are about L1.
Yes, that's right. So I did actually cut something where, because it was getting so elaborate and so rambling, I should have cut something from the beginning, I suspect, rather than later on. But I was comparing the situation of individuals talking to the examiner as against individuals talking to each other in a pair. And there are actually considerable differences. And one of the differences is that we need to keep careful account of is the fact that sometimes they may be local students who know each other and know each other's variety of English, so that listening is actually relatively easy for them. In other cases, they may be at an international centre where one of them is speaking, for example, German accented English, and another one is speaking Arabic accented English. And accent is a huge grey area in listening studies. And so that's something I think that we need to think carefully about. If they are going to talk in pairs, then perhaps the examiner also needs to contribute something to the conversation so that we can work out whether they are able to recognise standard English, let's say, from the examiner, as against an accent which may not be familiar to them.
And also a couple of points were raised about the extent to which colloquial language or informal language plays a role. As you said, you know, when people are making presentations, their language tends to be more formal or evenly paced. To what extent, it's perhaps unusual, it's perhaps not unlikely to happen that they have informal or colloquial language.
I think there are two levels. Sorry, Nikki, I think there are two levels here. I mean, we're talking about, first of all, the language itself, but we're also talking about the rhythms of the language. And colloquial language is likely to be of a very, very different rhythm from the kind of thing that they might have been exposed to. This is one of the headaches we have in listening, because the kind of recordings they are exposed to are often highly scripted, and therefore don't actually give them exposure to the kind of language they might encounter from an examiner who's trying to make them feel comfortable and at ease. Yeah. So I meant not just simply the linguistic content. I also meant the phonological content of the thing as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Well, John, that's been really interesting, and we only have a few minutes left to get wrapped up now. So thank you very much for your presentation today and for answering those questions.
Could I just say again that the whole thing will be available, a little bit more will be available when we put it online.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. I will emphasise that to all of the many participants today. Yes, the recordings will be going on our website, and in fact there'll be a longer version or some additional information slides available for John's recording. So if this is a subject that you found particularly interesting, please do follow the links to our website. I will be emailing those out, I hope before the end of the week, a link to the recordings on our website. Thank you once again very much, John.
Okay, thank you.